When I first took the night shift at the hospital, I thought I would just have to deal with a few sick patients and a dull silence. But from that first night, I knew this was more than just an ordinary hospital. It was around 2 a.m. when the phone in the nurse's station rang. The ringing seemed louder than usual in the stillness of the night. I picked it up. Yes, the emergency room. How can I help? A few seconds of silence. Then a weak, trembling voice said on the other end, Please help. Room 317. I hurriedly checked the patient files. Room 317 had not been used for years. I had not seen anyone there since I had come to this hospital. I had a feeling that one of the wrong patients might have gone there. I put the phone back in its place and walked with my flashlight to the third floor. The hallways were dark and empty. In the silence of the night, the only sound was my footsteps on the ceramic floor. I reached the door of room 317. I turned the knob and entered. The room was empty. The beds were covered with plastic sheets. The windows were closed, and the air smelled stale. But I had a strange feeling. It was as if someone was watching me. I shone the flashlight on the walls. There was no one. Maybe I was just imagining it. But when I turned to leave the room, I saw her. A woman in a hospital gown stood in the dark corner of the room. Her eyes were black and empty. Her mouth was open as if she were trying to say something, but no sound came from her throat. My body froze. I took a step back and the flashlight fell from my hand. Its light fell to the floor and illuminated the woman's face. And suddenly, she was gone. I don't know how I pulled myself out of that room. When I got back to the nurse's station, my breath was caught by the number. But what scared me most was the screen on the computer monitor. The incoming call had been registered, but not from an extension. The call had come from a line that had been disconnected years ago, room number 317. That night, I never set foot on that floor again. But the phone still rang now and then in the middle of the night. I'm a motorcycle courier. I always take night deliveries because the tips are better. But after the night I delivered that damn package, I never worked the night shift again. It was a bit cold that night and the streets were deserted. I took a delivery to an old alley in an abandoned neighborhood. It wasn't a long way, but I had a strange feeling when I checked the address on Google. It was almost outside the city, where no one lived anymore. When I arrived, there was an old, half-ruined house in front of me. The streetlights were dim and the shadows of dead trees fell on the walls. I rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door creaked open. A small old woman stood at the door. She was wearing old, shabby clothes and her white hair was messy and falling over her shoulders. She said in a weak voice, "Bring the package in, dear." I said, "No, Mom, I'm just going to deliver it to the door." But she just stood there, staring at me. There was a heavy feeling in the air. It was like something wasn't right. For a moment, I felt like I was dreaming and I was hallucinating. I gave her the package, and she closed the door without saying a word. When I turned back to the motorcycle, I felt someone watching me through the window. I turned around, but no one was there. A strange shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly gasped and drove away. But the real fear hit me the next morning. While I was eating breakfast, one of my colleagues, who lived in the same old neighborhood, was talking about an old incident. He said, "Where were you last night? You know that neighborhood is deserted, right?" I said, "Yeah, but I had an order." An old woman opened the door and took the package. At that moment, my colleague's hand went limp in surprise. His eyes widened, and he said, "That house has been empty for 10 years. The old woman who lived there is dead." The hot tea fell from my hand and spilled on the table. I couldn't control my shaking hands. I checked the sender's number on the package, but there was nothing. It was as if the order had never existed. I never worked the night shift again after that day. I still sometimes feel that somewhere in the darkness, that old woman is watching me. I had always loved my job. The night shift at the library meant absolute silence, rows of old books, and a chance to read. But since the night it happened, I have never been back in the library after sunset. It was a rainy night. There was nothing to be heard except the sound of rain hitting the windows. I was perusing the new book catalog when I heard something fall from the shelves. At first, I thought the wind had knocked one of the books over. But when I went to see what was wrong, I noticed 5 or 6 books lying on the floor, all in a row, neatly stacked. When I looked at the titles, my heart sank. They were all about serial murders. For a moment I thought someone was in the library. I turned on my flashlight and walked among the shelves. There was no one. I checked the security cameras. My breath caught in my chest. In the movie, the books seemed to have been pulled from the shelves themselves. There was no one around. Only a strange, vague shadow moved between the shelves. I returned to my desk in panic. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe the camera was broken. Maybe it was all an accident. But when I returned, my heart sank. On my desk, one of the books was open. It was as if someone had marked the exact page for me. I went forward and read. It was about a woman who had been killed in a terrible accident in this very library many years ago. It said that her body had been found in the basement, among the old books. Suddenly, I heard a soft breathing sound from behind me. When I turned my head, I saw nothing but trembling shadows on the wall. But I couldn't stay any longer. I grabbed my keys and stormed out of the library. The next day, I asked the manager to change my night shift. I never set foot there again after dark. But still, some nights when I pass by the library, the lights inside flicker for a moment, and it seems like a shadow moves between the shelves. My work in the morgue was always calm and easy. A quiet environment, a lot of paperwork, and the occasional moving of bodies. But recently, something strange had started happening. It all started when every night, a few of the drawers used to store bodies were found half open in the morning. At first, we thought maybe the locks were broken or someone on the night shift was not paying attention. But when the number of them increased, I became suspicious. One night, I decided to investigate the matter myself. It was afternoon, the air was colder than usual, and a strange silence filled the entire hall. I sat at the desk, raised the security cameras, and started watching. A few hours passed and nothing happened. My eyes were getting warm when I suddenly saw movement on the monitor. Drawer number 14. There was a very slow movement. I thought my eyes were wrong. I shook my head, put my hands over my eyes, and looked again. At that moment, drawer number 21 also opened slightly. My breath caught in my chest. I quickly jumped up and headed for the morgue. When I opened the door, everything was normal. The drawers were in place, the locks were closed, and there was no movement. But I had a strange feeling as if something was not right here. Reluctantly, I returned to the control room and rewound the film. This time I paid attention. The drawers just wouldn't open. Something was moving inside them. I narrowed my eyes, turned up the brightness of the screen, and froze. The bodies that should have been motionless were moving. Slowly at first, then more violently. One of them, a woman with long hair, suddenly pulled her hand out of the drawer as if she was struggling. But just before she could completely get out of the drawer, the image cut off. I caught my breath. I quickly ran to the morgue, opened the door, went to drawer 14 and pulled it out with shaking hands. The woman's body, exactly as it should have been. Cold, motionless, her eyes closed. Everything was normal, but I was sure something was wrong here. I always thought that the night shift at the emergency center was quieter than the other shifts. Usually, there were fewer emergency calls, except for 1 or 2 accidents or street fights. But that night, something happened that still makes my hair stand on end when I think about it. It was after 2 in the morning. The air outside was dark and heavy, and the center hall was almost empty. I was checking the reports on the monitor when the phone rang. On the screen, a number appeared, accompanied by an address. According to my training, I immediately picked up the phone and said, "Emergency 115, what's wrong?" There was silence for a few moments. Only the sound of broken breaths came. It seemed like someone was on the line, but they couldn't speak. "Hello? Can you hear me? Do you need help?" There was no answer, just a faint hissing sound. Then, the call was disconnected. I glanced at the number. According to protocol, I was supposed to check the address. I entered the number into the system, but what appeared on the screen made my heart stop for a moment. The registered address was for an abandoned house, an old building on the outskirts of town that, according to records, had burned down years ago and was completely abandoned. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself that maybe someone had used the phone there. I called the police and reported the matter. They said they would send a patrol unit to the scene. I thought it was all over, but 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same number, same address. This time, my heart beat harder. I picked up the phone and said in a louder voice, "Emergency 115. Please speak if you have a problem." Again, the same gasping sound. Then, a very quiet voice, as if someone said from afar, "Help." It was a woman's voice, weak and full of fear. I said quickly, "Where are you? What's wrong?" But the voice didn't continue. Just a long hissing sound, and then the call was disconnected. With shaking hands, I checked the number in the system again. It was the same address. I quickly called the police and anxiously told them that the call had been repeated. The patrol officer who had gone to the scene answered, "We're here, but the building is empty. There's no one here." I felt dizzy. But what was most frightening of all was the officer's next words. "Really? You said the call was made from the phone here, right?" "Yes, the number is registered." He was silent for a few moments, and then, in a hoarse voice, he said, "Impossible. There's no phone in this house. The phone line was cut off years ago." I caught my breath. I stayed at the monitor screen. The number was still there. The incoming calls were recorded, but from a place where they shouldn't be. That night, the phone didn't ring again. But still, every time I work the night shift, I feel like that woman. Maybe she's still waiting for someone to help her. I work at a gas station, a quiet, almost deserted road, where there is no sound at night except for the sound of the wind and the occasional passing car. Usually, night shifts go by without any problems. All I have to do is fill up the cars and watch the clock until my shift ends. But everything changed when an old car arrived at the gas station every night. It was old, its paint was turning yellow, and its headlights were dim and weak. Every night, at exactly 2 a.m., it would arrive, stop by the pump fuel into the tank, and then no one would get out of the car. I would always look at it in surprise, but when I tried to go to the car to help, there was no one in sight. It was as if the car had no driver. At first, I thought it might be a customer in a hurry and leaving immediately after refueling, but every night it happened exactly the same. Always the same time. The same car, the same quiet sounds from the engine. It was a strange repetition that began to make me feel that something was wrong. That night, I decided to check the security cameras. As always, The cameras were on, but when I opened the image, my leg trembled with fear. The old car stopped, as it usually did. But this time, something seemed strange. I looked more carefully and realized that there was no one behind the wheel. No one was in the car. The clear, crisp image from the camera showed the car as it stood, but there was no movement and no sound other than the sound of the engine. I rewound the film and looked more closely. Just as I had expected, the car had driven away without a driver and no sign of anyone, with the engine off and the windows down. What does that mean? How could a car move without a driver? My hands went cold with fear. As my mind was filled with unanswered questions, the cameras suddenly turned off and nothing else was recorded. The next night, the car came again, but this time I decided to stay away from the car and not go near it at all. All I wanted was for the night to end and for me to never see that car again. Even now, when I think back to that night, I don't know what that car was, or who the driver or the mysterious being who was never seen. I was a simple police officer at the Paris police station in 1997. That day, as usual, we were busy reviewing the daily reports when suddenly the door to the station opened and an elderly woman, with a worried and anxious face, entered. Her eyes were full of pleading, as if she knew something we didn't. She came to my desk and said in a trembling voice, "Please help me. My husband will be killed in an accident in a few hours." My colleagues and I looked at each other. How could this be possible? I asked her, "How do you know this, madam?" She gave me a look that I still remember after all these years. She said with complete certainty, "Just know that I'm right. You can't stop it, but just know that it's going to happen." My colleague grinned and said under his breath, "Another fortune teller." The woman repeated her words and asked us to believe her. But what could we do? There was no evidence, no sign, nothing to take legal action against. So, I nodded dismissively and tried to calm her down. But when she saw that we weren't taking her seriously, she sighed, wiped her tears, and walked out the door. About an hour later, the station phone rang. One of the officers answered, but a moment later his face turned pale. He whispered, "No, it's impossible." We were all curious. When the call ended, the officer looked at us with terrified eyes and said, "There was an accident. The woman's husband died." A heavy silence fell over the station. None of us dared to say anything. I jumped up at that moment, grabbed my coat, and said, "We have to find him." We quickly went to the same street where we had seen him, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had never been there. Even the station's CCTV cameras showed no sign of him coming or going. That night, when I was alone, his voice kept repeating in my ear, "Just know that it's going to happen." And still, after all these years, I don't know who he was. Maybe a sea, maybe a ghost, maybe something beyond our comprehension. I was never a person who believed in ghosts and supernatural stories, but what I saw in Mexico in year 6 changed my mind forever. I am Julio, the man who buried his wife, and a week later, he saw him again in his house. Everything started with that damn accident. Maria, my wife, died in a terrible car accident. I couldn't believe it. How was it possible? That morning, I kissed her while she had a smile, and now I had to choose a coffin. I hardly remember his funeral. Everything was in a haze of sadness. The sound of crying, the priest who prayed, and the coffin that disappeared in the darkness of the grave. It was over. Maria had gone forever. But just a week later, a nightmare came out of the reality. It was night. I woke up to sleep. It was about 2 half nights. Who could come to the house of a hot man at that hour? I opened the door with sleepy and hearty eyes that were fast for no reason, and the whole world turned around. Maria was standing behind the door. My breaths had come. My legs were loose and I went back. As he was always, he was a familiar smile with his favorite dress. But his eyes seemed a little empty, as if he had forgotten something. Her lips shook slowly. Julio, why don't you open the door? The sound, the tone, everything was real. There was neither a ghost nor a nightmare that came from my tired mind. But Maria was dead. With a trembling hand, I turned on the light and approached him. Grabbed his hand. It was warm, and it had a pulse. No, it was impossible. Had come from the shock of my tone. But the only thing I could ask was, "You? Where were you?" Maria had a confused face. It was as if he didn't know what I was talking about. He said he was just falling asleep and now he was back. He remembers nothing about the accident, his death, and his funeral. I was crazy. That night I took him to the hospital. The doctors reviewed. Maria was completely alive. Her heart was normal. Her blood pressure was normal, and there was no sign of injury. But that was not possible. We had buried him. A few days later, when we went to the cemetery, what we saw forever conquered my mind. Maria's tombstone was there. The grave was still closed. There was no sign of exhumation or movement. When we asked the graveyard to open the grave, my hands and feet froze. Maria's body was still there, frozen, rotten, as it was buried a week ago. If Maria had been buried here, then who was the woman standing beside me? This question still conquers my mind at night.